So are the sins of my heart more serious than the sins of my flesh?
Mm-hmm. You know, in Catholic theology, we talk about for a person to be culpable of sin. So we make that distinction between the moral gravity of a sin and a person's culpability for a sin. So think, for example, if I go out hunting, I've used this example before. If I go out hunting and I hear something rustling in the bushes and I shoot into the bushes and kill my buddy who's hunting with me, I've just killed someone. That's objectively evil. To kill an innocent person is objectively evil. But I'm not guilty, not even before the civil law, let alone the moral law. I'm not guilty of having committed murder because I didn't know it was him. I thought it was a deer. Now, if I do that twice, I've learned something the first time, and so I'm more culpable the second time, but that's how we make that distinction. So when you talk about sins of my heart, sins of my flesh, of course, all sins are going to be committed in one way or another in the flesh because we operate out of this. This is what we have to operate with.
Yeah.
But some sins that we might commit, we know that they're wrong. We're free to not commit them, and yet we still commit them. We could say that we're more culpable for such a sin.
That's right.
Than a sin that I might do. You know, someone cuts me off in traffic and I react in a rude way. Maybe I show a rude gesture to them.
It's always funny to me. I just imagine you getting angry at traffic. It's just fun.
If that happens, then that's not something that I really gave much thought to, didn't consent at a deep level to, and so forth. I still should overcome my quick anger, my quick temper, if that happens to me.
Yeah. And this week we're sort of diving into some of that in this week's gospel, transitioning from John 6 into Mark. So.
Yeah, and Jesus makes the point in this gospel. So we'll hear that at the very end. So this gospel comes from the 7th chapter of the Gospel of Mark. When the Pharisees with some scribes who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus, they observed that some of his disciples ate their meals with unclean, that is, unwashed, hands. For the Pharisees, and in fact all Jews, do not eat without carefully washing their hands, keeping the tradition of the elders. And on coming from the marketplace, they do not eat without purifying themselves. And there are many other things that they have traditionally observed, the purification of cups and jugs and kettles and beds. So the Pharisees and scribes questioned him, "Why do your disciples not follow the tradition of the elders, but instead eat a meal with unclean hands?" And he responded, "Well did Isaiah prophesy about you hypocrites, as it is written, 'This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines human precepts. You disregard God's commandment, but cling to human tradition.'" He summoned the crowd again and said to them, "Hear me, all of you, and understand. Nothing that enters one from outside can defile that person, but the things that come out from within are what defile. From within people, from their hearts, come evil thoughts, unchastity, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, licentiousness, envy, blasphemy, arrogance, folly. All these evils come from within, and they defile." Thus far, the Gospel of Mark. So he's answering the question that you asked.
Sure.
Because all of these things that he lists are things that are done in the body. They're also done in the body, but they require freedom, thought, intention. And so That's what he means by these are the things that defile. They were juxtaposing eating things that were not purified properly. That's taking something in from outside. Now, of course, if a person eats something to offend God, they're committing sin. But then that comes from the heart. So that's for us to make that distinction. We use the sacrament of reconciliation in the church. Our Lord gave us that gift of being able to reconcile with God when we have fallen into sin after baptism. And so using that sacrament helps us in two ways. One, it simply does help us to overcome sin. It absolves us from sins that we've committed. But two, when we use it regularly, and this is an important part of this, when we use it regularly, it helps us to actually grow in virtues, to grow in the opposite habits. The way to overcome sin, especially sinful habits, is to grow in the virtues.
It's beautiful. Yeah, this is an interesting gospel in that I find it interesting in just the sense that we're looking at, tradition, like, sort of, as it says, like, for Pharisees, and in fact, all Jews do not eat, without carefully wash their hands, et cetera, et cetera. It's interesting because we reflect on that tradition. And so for those of us who, like, didn't sort of convert from, sort of traditional Judaism to Catholicism or something like that, it's like we need to sort of educate ourselves on what some of these things mean. But also at the end of this gospel, I just think it's interesting that Jesus says, sins from the heart, evil thoughts, unchastity, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice. Like when I read those things, it's like he's talking about today. It's amazing how when I read those things, I'm like, oh, this is like 100% of what we are sort of dealing with today in the culture. Just hop on X, Twitter, formerly known as Twitter, X, right. Or hop on, any of our media or politics and things that are going on that are really out there. They're not things that are, sort of really in here all the time. I mean, those sins are, can be present in our hearts, but man, you see it everywhere. If you're watching the news and you see what's going on, it's kind of interesting to me to see how similar it is to today.
In the pastoral letter, I talked about the banality in our culture, things that are banal in our culture. And, banal means things that are old and trite and worn and not original. And all sin is that. All sin is banal. Sometimes people will ask priests if they hear new sins. And after you've been a priest for a little while hearing confessions, you don't really hear new sins because sin is old. And the particular ways that we sin, they're not infinitely variable. They're basically old. What's always original, what's always new, what always stands out is holiness. You might, if you're driving in traffic, are you going to notice the people who are honking the horn or cutting each other off and so forth? Or are you going to notice the people who are driving in a really courteous way, who let you cut into traffic when you need to and so forth? That's what you notice. That's what seems original, unusual. If you go on to any of your favorite news feed, whatever it is, if you look at YouTube, if you look at postings on Facebook, if you see the headlines in the Tulsa World or anywhere else, trying to find something that's positive, that's optimistic, that's trying to build people up. It can be hard to do. It actually is hard to do. I have found, though, that you can Google search for good news stories about good things happening, things like that. And they are out there. You can find them, but editors don't seem to choose them. If it bleeds, it leads. That's the old line.
That's right.
And so when Jesus is giving this list, every century can identify with this list because there's nothing really new there. We're still doing the same things.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one thing that might be new, or at least each age would recognize some things that are new. Adultery, for example. Of course, at various points in time, that was just a really, really low, terrible thing that someone might do. It still is in its reality, but watch TV. TV doesn't treat it as if it's new, or movies or whatever. You know, if you love someone, you really should go after whoever you love.
Sure. Sort of what's maybe call it like the social norms. There's certain sins that maybe at different points in history,
Right.
the larger public or the mob, if you will, would
Right.
say, yeah, that is wrong. But then at other times they might culturally say, oh, actually, you know, that's not necessarily wrong.
The cultural things. Teaching as doctrines, human precepts. Think about, for example, the way that politicians will talk about abortion as reproductive freedom,
Mm-hmm.
as women's rights. That's a human precept, freedom and rights. But doctrines, the doctrine of the sanctity of life is the doctrine. But now what they're teaching as doctrines are the precepts, reproductive freedom and so forth, and skipping over the actual doctrine of the right to life. So those are some examples of things in our own culture now. Blaspheming, that's something. Now let's see, he doesn't have on here calumny. Maybe it fits under blasphemy. But that's one of the things that this culture, I think, is very guilty of, is the way that we just blast each other on social media or whatever. You know, people are just so rude, so mean to each other in those forums in a way that they would never be in person. You know, the things that people might say of someone in a forum, they would never say to them in person.
No.
There's a seeming anonymity within that.
And if they would say them in person, then my goodness, how far the culture has fallen. I mean, but I would agree. I mean, just my lived experience of just seeing what's online, and especially like social media and things like that, and how people are sort of what I call, keyboard warriors. But then when it comes to sort of interacting with people face to face,
or even supposedly defending the gospel. You know, if you're defending the gospel by blasting people, then you're not doing the gospel any favors. You know, you're proving that it's not working.
Yeah. Sin is always old, or sin is old. Holiness is always new. I think that's I've never heard it said like that. But in my life, whenever I have done the right thing, I've had, not every time, but people have reacted.
Mm-hmm.
I remember living in New York City for a summer when I was an undergraduate, and I was from the middle of the map. I was not from there. And I was on the subway all the time. And I would hold the subway door for people who were rushing to get on. And a few times I had people, kind of look at me peculiar and actually tell me, you're not from around here, are you?
Yeah.
Kind of a thing.
That's right.
And in their own way,
Yeah.
it made those comments to me.
Yeah.
And I'm like, and I would be like, oh, it must be the way I dress or the way I talk or the way I fix my hair or whatever. Right. And then, it was always like, yeah, I mean, we knew the second you held that door for those people, that's just not something that you do. But also saying it in a way of like, it was their sort of friendly way of sort of recognizing that was really nice of you to do that. You don't see that very often, kind of a thing. And that's one small moment, but most of the time when we do good things, it's worth mentioning, it's not noticed actually. And sometimes the hardest times to do the right thing, I find, are, when people aren't looking, and things like that. It may be easy to hold the door on a subway when there's 50 people watching you, because a lot of people are watching. You can put on a show. But anyway, so.
Well, or you've said before, insightfully, it may be easy to do that, but then to go home and be patient as I fix the kids' meal or whatever.
That's right.
And
do those activities.
The thing that's somehow heroic versus the thing that's just the ordinary right thing that I need to do can be harder. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Or to be nice to the neighbors. We had all the kids in the neighborhood playing at our house all the time because there were 12 of us. And so all of us knew 5 or 6 kids in the neighborhood. So there were always lots of kids. And it's easier to be nice to your friends than to be nice to your siblings.
Oh, yeah.
And so, yeah.
Totally lived experience.
I sometimes have said to kids, speaking in schools or whatever, did you ever notice that bad and sad rhyme?
Sure.
They're like, they do. Yes, they do. Bad and sad rhyme. And it's a nice little joke in a way, and it's fun for kids to recognize that. But it also is good for us and helps us in terms of using the sacrament of reconciliation regularly. Mm-hmm. Because what keeps a lot of people from it is a sense of shame or a sense of embarrassment. And they're not focusing on what they would be focusing on, for example, if they were covered in mud and they were going to go to get in a shower. Boy, they'd be so focused on this is going to be great to get all that mud off of me. They wouldn't be focused on, oh my gosh, I'm covered in mud, I don't want to go. They wouldn't say that. Mm-hmm. And so similarly, we commit sin all the time despite our best efforts because we are sinners. That's who we are. And so knowing that about ourselves, to recognize regularly I can go to be with the Lord in a manner in which He's going to cleanse me totally. If we would focus on that aspect of reconciliation, and if we would remember each time how good we felt, afterwards, how good we felt coming out, that would spur us on to more regularly use the sacrament. Keep in mind you can go anonymously. All confessionals should be set up in such a way that you can go anonymously. Even in that room at the Eucharistic Congress with 70 stations, there were 6 along the wall on one side that were behind a screen. Mm-hmm. So even there was a way for people to make an anonymous confession. Mm-hmm. Nowadays, we can use apps. There are literally apps on the phone for confession, and it will guide you through an examination of conscience, and it will let you click
certain sins
on categories of sin.
Might be helpful in a pinch.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. It has the act of contrition. So often people get really nervous because they forgot how to say the act of contrition. Any priest, confessor that you go to will be happy to help you say the act of contrition, or you can make one up on your own, just spontaneously. But it's helpful to other people in the line if it's a long line.
Man, we've talked about those logistics.
If you have one that's relatively short that you can pull up on the phone or that you know by heart to pray it more efficiently.
Yeah, I always use the notes on my phone nowadays. I mean, I think that was a struggle years ago. Is like, all right, now I've examined my conscience. Now I need to memorize the examen of my conscience so I can go deliver this speech in there to this priest, kind of a thing.
Yeah.
Going back to your analogy of if you got mud on yourself, I think I think I'm probably speaking to my fellow sort of type A people who are maybe a little more black and white and linear. There's a challenge, I think, because when I go to confession, sort of I'm washing the mud off, but it's not, the intention of that process is not just for the sake of being clean. Mm-hmm. It's so that I can go live and live well and not, it's not just, and I think sometimes there's a temptation to kind of, I'm going to confession just to clean off. So my goal is just to now freeze in a frozen mold and just never get dirty ever again. Or, it's not for the sake of that. It's so that we can then now live clean and go live and share and be, and not just. Mm-hmm. And so I think that there's a temptation sometimes to think, oh gosh, I just gotta, live this, super clean way, or I don't know. Am I making sense?
Yes, a person can become scrupulous about not sinning again. And what we promise when we make a confession and we say the act of contrition, we're promising to do what we can to avoid the near occasion of sin. We're not promising to never sin again.
Mm-hmm.
We're not in control of that. We're promising to do what we can to avoid the near occasion of sin. Regular confession also helps a person to identify habits of sin. If you find that there's something that you're confessing over and over and over, then you start to recognize, okay, there's something habitual about this with me. Let me try to unpack that and see what can I do to try to help break that up.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Because sin always is going to be something that makes us unhappy. It's always going to get in the way of relationships. The more that we can avoid sin, the more that we can overcome habits of sin, the happier we'll be.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There's a question here. What makes a priest confession unique or different? Is a priest confession actually different?
Well, it's done in front of a mirror, for one thing. No, that's an old joke. What makes nothing makes a priest's confession unique or different.
Right.
Priests are sinners like anyone. When Pope Francis was newly elected, in one of those early interviews, the interviewer asked him, "What do you want people to know about you?" And he thought about it for a few seconds, and he said, "I'm a sinner." Well, yes, he is a sinner. Mm-hmm. Priests often go to confession, and many people often go to confession to a regular confessor.
Mm-hmm.
Now, priests are always encouraged to have a spiritual director as well, and often priests use their spiritual director also as their confessor if he's a priest. So that would be the only thing. But in terms of the challenges that priests are faced with in living life, they're going to be the same as anybody. And so there's nothing unique or different about that.
Are priest confessors as varied as any other lay person, or does a bishop oftentimes go to confession with another bishop, or not necessarily?
Well, so think in terms of, for example, in seminary, for example, the reason that the seminary operates with an internal forum faculty and an external forum faculty, in part is because of confession. So spiritual directors in the seminary are on the internal forum faculty. That means that the seminarians can talk to their spiritual director about anything, and that spiritual director can never talk to the faculty, the external forum faculty, about whatever he's talking to a seminarian about. Because all of those things need to be dealt with, and he's not going to bring them up, or he's going to be afraid to bring them up if they're going to be talked about outside, but also because of confession. And so since a seminarian may use the same person as spiritual director and confessor, it can be hard to remember what is what. A bishop should not hear the confessions of his priests for the same reason. The priests need to be able to talk to their confessor about anything they're dealing with. A bishop in that role would be an external forum. And so a bishop needs to be able to act on things that he might learn about priests. And so if he learns about something in confession, he's not going to be able to act on that.
Mm-hmm.
So there are some differences in that respect, but bishops might go to a priest for confession, just not one of his. For my case, I use my spiritual director, who is the retired Archbishop Beltran. Eusebius Beltran has been my spiritual director during all my time here in Tulsa. And so when I see him, which is usually monthly, I also use him as a confessor. So I think probably most bishops do something like that.
Is confession still legit if you do it on Zoom?
No, and that's a serious question that's asked, spiritual direction can be
I tried
done.
to ask it like a millennial, that's what I was trying
Well, you meant asking for a friend.
Yeah.
Spiritual direction can be done over Zoom, virtually.
Sure. Which is really more of a conversation.
Yeah. But if you, so I hadn't thought of that, but if you're a priest who's using another priest as your spiritual director, and also you want to use him as your confessor, you can't do that in the same. You might have a Zoom meeting to talk about your spiritual direction, but he can't absolve you through Zoom, and or over the phone or any of that. Yeah.
Do you have to be wearing a stole to offer the sacrament? What is kind of I know that it's a little bit, I know that it's sort of more of a, what are the rules, sort of a thing, which I think, to some is maybe a boring thing, but to some is kind of interesting. Like, do you have to have a stole on,
I mean, we get back into the gospel with
That's right.
that.
Exactly.
And, a lot of priests will carry what's called a travel stole in their, a lot of priests will carry an anointing of the sick kit, a little kit that you have in your glove compartment that has the oil of the sick, the little prayer book for the anointing of the sick, and oftentimes a little purple stole that you can put on, so that you have at least the basic semblance of the liturgical dress for the sacrament. But it's not required, and there are some circumstances where it would be hard to accomplish, and so it's not required. Now, in the parish on Saturday afternoon, I'm going to dress in an alb with a stole, and I ought to do that. But if I'm at a retreat, I might not.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know some priests will often put that stole on their little table in their office, so it's kind of right there. And it almost is, I don't know. I've always read that as sort of kind of a charming thing, like, hey, the door is open if you ever, need to go to confession, depending on who the person is.
I knew a confessor at the seminary in New Orleans who would hand you a crucifix. He held a crucifix
during reconciliation.
He would hand you a crucifix to hold during reconciliation. And it was kind of a powerful thing, you're holding on to the reason why you can do this. Super
powerful. I know there's just stories of saints who would just hold the crucifix every night. I know there's a movement, there was a ministry for a while there of these like sort of oddly shaped crosses, these sort of prayer crosses that you hold. So it was popular to kind of buy those and get those. And they're kind of these really nice sort of layered pieces of wood that have been, sort of, I don't know, you would say this better than I would, like sort of glued together, but then sanded down and smooth so it holds in your hand nicely. It's not rigid, but it's in the shape of a cross. It's rounded. And so the stories of the saints, even just holding the crucifix in prayer, that's
one of the questions here is if it's been a long time.
Yeah.
And again, that...
Do I need to write a paper for you?
That often comes up.
On my life.
And the thing that I would recommend, because it's something that I experience often, is a person who hasn't been to confession in a long time, and they haven't really made much of an examination of conscience prior to coming. So they just haven't been aware that there even is such a thing or that they should do such a thing. But the best thing to do anytime, but especially if you haven't been to confession in a long time, is to just look up an examination of conscience. They're all over. You can find various ones on the internet. To go through it, because it will help you remember, okay, what are things, if it's been 10 years, I should try to confess things that I can remember even 10 years ago. What are things that I can remember? An examination of conscience will help me remember things that I otherwise might not. So I can make a good confession and not leave thinking, oh, wow, I remember, now I forgot about that or this or that.
Mm-hmm.
But the main thing, if it's been a long time, is to just come, to not be afraid,
Absolutely.
To not worry about the prayer, to not worry about what you're going to say, any of it. Just come. The priest can take you through the whole thing. God is waiting. He's the one who's inspiring you to think of it. Whenever I did post-abortion healing retreats, of course, we always have the sacrament of confession as a part of that retreat. But it's almost never the case that the person who's coming on that retreat hasn't already confessed the abortion. They usually already have. But uniting the confession of the abortion with this healing journey that they're doing as a part of this retreat often was also very powerful for them. They still wanted to do that, even though they had already confessed it. So in general, we don't need to reconfess things that we've already confessed, even if we feel bad about those things. But we confess things that we've done since the last time we were at confession. Unless you remember something that you haven't confessed before.
Right.
It might be a long time ago, and something happens like a revival, and you think, oh, I never really confessed that. Well, then go ahead.
Yeah, sometimes too. Sometimes we do, even after confessing sins, we've sought reconciliation for those sins. Sometimes they'll come back into our minds later, even after we've received forgiveness. And that's where prayers of deliverance oftentimes can be helpful to deliver us from those thoughts.
And to remember grief. So I think that often, and this was very often the case with people who were post-abortive, that they would feel guilty even after they had been to confession and been absolved. They would just feel so guilty. But really, the guilt might simply be grief because they've lost this child of theirs, and they need to grieve over that loss. If they haven't understood that yet and really gone through a grieving process, then maybe what they're experiencing is just pent-up, bottled-up grief that needs to be released.
Yeah. Sort of a kind of a funny question is, you'll see in TV and movies, which I know that's a bad way to start a question, but you'll see in TV and movies somebody who's a non-Catholic, or maybe they're Protestant, maybe they're not even Christian, but they'll come to a church and they'll come into a confessional and they'll sort of talk to the priest, or they're looking for advice, and they come to. So it begs the question, can a non-Catholic sort of receive the fullness of the sacrament? Would you invite them to come talk, or how would you approach that question around, can a Protestant come sort of talk to a priest about their sins or something?
At retreats, which is where you often encounter something like that, or meetings or something, like a revival or something. Certainly there may be people who are not Catholic who don't know that they can't be absolved in the same way that a Catholic can in the sacrament. And so then you can talk to them and pray with them, give them a blessing, offer a blessing to them. If they do know that they can't be absolved, then they shouldn't think that, well, I can't be absolved, so I can't go do this. No, you can still go do this. Many people hire a therapist
to sort of tell them the problems.
And when they talk to their therapist, they're largely sometimes talking about their sins, things that they do that cause problems in their relationships or in their own sense of self. And that's what goes on in confession too. And so, yes, they can do that too.
Absolutely. That's interesting. So maybe there's something to those movie priests talking to people or something.
Yeah, that's right.
But anyway, so get back to confession. The door is open. So
yeah.
Awesome. Well, this has been Tulsa Time with Bishop David Konderla. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.